This is the worst it's ever been. Like, it feels different. I think, like, there's something seriously wrong.
Well, have you taken your painkillers? What about them stick-on heat patches I got you?
Nothing's helping. Mum, can I just go home?
Right, come here. Look, you are the strongest person I know, okay? And all you've got to do is get through today, and then if you're still this bad tomorrow, I'll let you stay at home. Okay, I promise. Okay.
Thought the doctors were helping. No, they just keep fobbing me off. Just keep pushing, yeah?
Look, these are the last ones. Any more, me nan will notice.
Thank you.
Keep them safe. Make them last.
Miss, our Bunsen burner isn't working.
Have you checked your gas taps on properly?
Mm-hmm.
Right, give it a... Right.
Stop filming!
It's out! It's out! It's out, miss, it's out! Don't you dare! Are you okay, miss?
Yeah, I'm all right.
You should have tried to all right, that miss.
You said it wasn't working.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Are you sure you don't want to go and get checked out at the hospital?
Oh, it's a hairdresser that I need, not a doctor.
Tonya, what's happened? Are you okay?
There's been a serious incident. A science experiment went wrong and Tonya ran away from the class.
It was an accident.
Oh, no, it wasn't.
Excuse me? Tonya said it was an accident, then it was an accident.
I came this close to being really hurt. You could have been hurt. You weren't listening, Tonya, and it's not for the first time. She has been on another planet all week. I hate to say this, right? But I think that she's smoking cannabis.
You what?
What makes you say that, Miss Chandra?
Because she's just been coming into my lessons and falling asleep and she's totally spaced out.
No, I haven't. I swear.
Who do you think you are, saying things like that about my Tonya?
Well, she's your daughter. You must have noticed that something's not right with her.
Obviously, I've noticed something isn't right with her. She's in constant pain and no one will help her. And if there was an accident in the science lab, there's only one person to blame, and that's the teacher in charge.
Nikki, come on.
No, and if the kids weren't listening, why on earth would you go through with the experiment, eh? Where was that on your risk assessment?
You are not blaming your bad parenting on me.
Said the woman who shared a bloke with her own daughter.
Do you think shouting like fishwives is a suitable way to behave in front of a student? Miss Chandra, you've had a horrible shock. I want you to take the rest of the day off a timetable and make a start on your incident report. Wendy will give you all the help that you need. I'm afraid we can't ignore this accusation, Nikki. Given Tonya's behaviour, clearly something's not right here.
Obviously. I've been saying that all along. She's sick and no one is helping me.
What about Miss Chandra's observations? Is there a possibility?
Oh, God, you can't be serious. Come on.
Well, Nikki, I have to say, her pupils, they don't look normal.
Right, well, they could be like that for any reason. Look, if you think Tonya's taking drugs, then go ahead and search her. But I'm telling you now, you're going to look stupid.
Mr. Casey, can you organise a search of Tonya's bag and locker, please?
I'll get Mike to lead.
Oh, what police?
He's the school liaison officer.
Right, fine. We've nothing to hide.
That's sick, man.
Right, it's not funny, okay? Miss Chandra could have been killed.
It was quite bad.
And it could have been any of us who got hurt.
I've got to see a man about a dog.
You're treating me like I'm a criminal.
It's protocol.
It's heavy-handed.
If you've done nothing wrong, then you've got nothing to worry about.
Okay, come on.
You're always targeting me.
That's not true, Tonya.
We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't follow up on an accusation like this.
Miss Chandra only said it because she hates him.
Tonya.
So, are you going to search every other kid's locker because he upset a teacher?
We need to, yes.
Right, well, I'm going to apologise to Tonya when you're proven wrong.
Which one is it?
It's just that one.
We're going to find 27% of 80, so first thing we need to do is find out what happened. Come on, Sydney, 80 divided by 10.
Tonya!
I'm sorry, Dante. I need to leave.
I'll take it as a compliment. You got me mixed up with Mr. Charles.
Tonya? Tonya? Just open it. Oh my God! Tonya! Tonya! You look after her and I'll get Mr. Todd.
You're gonna be all right, Tonya, I promise. What's going on?
It's all right, baby. I'm here. You're in hospital.
I took too many painkillers. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Listen, you have got nothing to be sorry for. You've had to have an operation. They found endometriosis.
So it wasn't the painkillers?
No.
And I was right. I knew I wasn't making it up.
I always believed you.
But if they'd listen,
I know, baby.
but we can fight it. Though, now we know what it is.
Well, it's never gonna go away, baby. But I promise you, I'm gonna help you manage it, okay? I love you so much.
I love you too.
Get some sleep, baby. Some sleep. Mom's here.